Hey everybody, I'm Cody.
And I'm Brent.
And we are the Hugonauts, here to review and discuss for you the best science fiction novels of all time, or sometimes not novels, right, Brent?
Yeah, this week we're doing two short story collections, Ted Chiang's Stories of Your Life and Others, plus Exhalation. And notably, even if you haven't read these, if you've seen the movie Arrival, the short story of Your Life is what the movie Arrival is based on. So we'll get into that. Next week, we were talking about Cixin Liu's Three-Body Problem series.
Or Remembrance of Earth's Past trilogy is what it's really called, but Brent doesn't want to get it that close to Proust.
Yeah, and nobody knows that one. It's a three-body problem. Anyway, and we were joined by Adam McMinch, which will be really great. So we can talk about the books, but also talk about the differences between the English and the Chinese translation. So anyway, that will be really fun. If you are watching the video on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss that one. And if you're listening to the podcast, please do follow us so that you can catch Cixin Liu next week. So with that, let's get into Ted Chiang.
So Ted Chiang is a technical writer in the software field who just likes to write fiction when he, quote, comes up with a good idea. He's written 18 short stories and novellas over a 32-year career, and they're all incredible, in our opinion. The Stories of Your Life is the first collection that was published in 2002. It is about 10 and a half hours on audiobook, or about 279 pages. Exhalation is the second collection of short stories. This was published in 2019. It's about 11 and a half hours on audiobook and 362 pages on the paper. With only 18 stories out, he's collected 4 of each major science fiction award and the Jack Campbell Award. And he is just such a phenomenal author, and maybe it's for the best that he publishes when he has a good idea, because everything is great. His stories kind of have this quintessential the science fiction element of imposing an idea on our world and seeing how it would play out. But they also, unlike a lot of other science fiction, he will invert that idea and sometimes have an alien world or a fantasy world that he takes an idea or a piece of science or something from the real world and imposes that on the other world, which is a fantastic way of showing an audience how that idea works in our world. It's like a new context for a real thing, which I think is one of the things that makes him so incredible. He also writes a lot of different types of stories. He frames his stories in a lot of different ways, a lot of different authorial voices, from biblical or mythological stories to Victorian era fantasy to current science fiction to future science fiction to alien worlds, all sorts of settings and voices. And the beauty of his writing is that he's really able to convey high concept, intellectual or philosophical ideas with through metaphor that is simple enough, or context that is simple enough for us to kind of intuit, for the audience to intuit or viscerally understand those ideas a little bit better. And he's beautiful. He's one of my very favorite writers. Very excited to talk to him or talk about him today. Would be very excited to talk to him, but it's not. That's not what we're doing here. Brent, what do you think of Ted Chiang's body of work?
Yeah, for sure. These were super fun to read. I'm going to give them a 4 out of 5 stars. Truly incredible ideas about future technologies. Really, really, really interesting alternate worlds, the mythology. And there's really interesting moral implications to all of it as well that he really spells out in a way that I like quite a lot. Very occasionally it feels like the characters are slightly less well developed, or the morality is like, he's just doing so much in a small package that sometimes it feels like a little overcrowded, but it almost feels like not fair to use that as a criticism. But anyway, 4 out of 5 stars, really loved it. How about you?
Yeah, I'm 5 out of 5. I mean, like I said, he's one of my very favorite writers. I think he just delivers on everything writing is supposed to be. He is like you said, small package, and he's delivering not only these concepts, these wonderful scientific and philosophical ideas, but he wraps them up in really enjoyable narrative arcs and characters and settings.
Yeah.
So that being said, let's get into it. Like you heard in the summary, we're not really going to kind of summarize each story because there's a million stories. Just talk about what he's like in general. And if we use this story as an example, we'll give you a little context for those.
Also, really curious to hear what you all think of these books. So please do reach out to us at Hugonauts Podcast on socials if you have read these, have thoughts. We'd love to hear what you think. And then we post some like bonus content there too. But
it's going to be a little. I wrote a little ditty about Ted Chiang.
Yeah, Cody's also in a band and is a songwriter. I don't know if you'll know this, but and loves Ted Chiang so much he wrote a Ted Chiang song. Anyway, it's really funny. So yeah, what did you think of the characters in these stories, Cody?
The characters are really fleshed out. I kind of disagree that they're flat sometimes. I think that he makes that work through his voices, the way he frames the stories. I think some of the stories that have less fleshed out characters are written in such a way that it makes sense and it's totally fine. But any story where he's that's either first person or third person omnipotent, the characters are super believable and really help us understand these ideas and also make me feel emotional.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, they're almost always like, their reactions feel just like superhuman and really help you. Yeah, it makes the stories feel real because the people in them feel like real people. Like nobody's perfect. People respond to situations in the ways that real people would, which is, I think, the mark of a good character. So yeah, no, I very much agree.
You have the spectrum of stories. So from a character perspective, you have stories like Division by Zero, right? In Stories of Your Life and Others, which is about a mathematician who finds an equation that makes her think differently about makes her question reality and her understanding of math in such a visceral way that she has a problem with her relationship. And that story is so narrowly focused in on the characters and really is about relationship, but through this science fiction idea. And so that one's a very emotional, character focused. And then you have the broader stuff. Like what's the example you have here that you use as
the liking what you see? That's the one about caliagnosia. So that's the basically they invent like a way to modify your brain so that you can no longer tell if someone is attractive or not. And there's a school that is debating, a college that's debating making it mandatory for all the people who go to the school to like have this procedure done. And it's literally just like, it's a debate. So like between these two sides about like the morality and benefits of this future technology. And while I know he is achieving what he wanted to achieve by doing that, it did just feel like, to me, like a little on the nose. Like it doesn't feel so much like a story. It's like literally a debate about something that just hasn't happened yet. And so that's one where there were a couple characters, but they just like, it feels less like a story and more like a sort of like a moral philosophy essay. And there's a couple stories where that kind of happens a little bit.
And I agree with you on liking what you see, although the rest of the title of liking what you see is a documentary, liking what you see, a documentary. And that's how it's framed. So I guess that's where we might disagree a little bit. Like the characters are less personal and believable, or someone we want to latch onto in that story, but it is framed as a documentary, like interviews and news sources and debates, like you said, about this technology. So the framing is also a little less personal. So it doesn't feel wrong. It just does feel less personal because that's his purpose.
Well, it's so he like definitely achieved what he wanted to achieve. Just like for me personally, like the way I like engage with stories, like the messages land a lot better for me. Like when there is the story around it, like, I don't know, to me, that's probably like how our brains work. We just like to remember stories, not debates, but anyway.
That's true. That's true. I think that is how our brains work.
So he does something really interesting with his fantasy stories that you mentioned you liked quite a lot. Do you want to tell us about why those fantasy stories are so unique?
Yeah, usually you get either fantasy or science fiction, or there's some sort of mashup, but it really like leans one way or the other. But what he does is in his fantasy stories is he'll impose science on them and tell you about the rules of the magic and then treat it like the magic is science, and how those people in that world are exploring the magic from a scientific perspective. My favorite example would be 72 Letters, which is his story it's a Victorian era. It's based on the Jewish myth tradition of golems, which are the clay men. I can't think of the word right now for a clay statue that when you feed them a scroll of Hebrew characters, they will do what the scroll instructs them to do. And instead of just treating it like magic, his characters are scientists who are basically trying to code these golems by figuring out the right, quote, names or characters to write on the scrolls to make them into coding machines, AI machines. He also explores genetic manipulation through this magic. And so even his fantasy worlds are come at from a perspective of science, which is at least rare. I mean, the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin is a similar bend, also
for sure.
great. But
I think a lot of really good fantasy does that. Like, I agree with you. Where I like lose the thread sometimes with fantasy is where like it feels like it's kind of like getting made up as it goes along, where like there's no rules, and so like any situation can just be like MacGyvered out of by like making up new rules of magic or whatever. Anyway, yeah, he's very much not from that tradition. And yeah, I liked those fantastical stories quite a lot. And yeah, they did just like feel very sciencey. I guess like part of that is that people like literally the characters were scientists in them. But anyway, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think good fantasy requires the rules of the magic to be well defined. But I've not seen many authors take that next step into making it like scientists instead of sure. magicians or sorcerers playing under the rules. There's always kind of like a moral to his stories, or with the thing we're exploring, the idea we're exploring. And I feel like you thought sometimes it felt a little too transparent.
Yeah, just like a little on the nose. Yeah, in general, I really like it. Like he's always, he clearly like thinks a lot about morality and like how to find meaning in your life and like what it means to be a good person. And all the stories have like a really strong through line of morality. Sometimes, yeah, it just does feel a little too transparent. So we already talked about like the Caliagnosia story where it was the sort of the philosophical debate. I think another story that's a good example of that is, what was it called? Oh, The Truth of Fact, The Truth of Feeling from Exhalation. So in that story, it takes part in sort of like two narratives that flip back and forth. One is in the future where they have invented a technology that like records everything you see. And then you have basically perfect recall. Like you can see those memories anytime you want. And I think it's an idea I've thought about quite a lot as well. I think it's like certain to happen and has huge, interesting implications. And then it's intercut with a story of Europeans going to an African village where they had no written language. It was all oral tradition, and how the introduction of writing sort of changed everything and sort of the idea of writing as a technology. Anyway, overall, I actually really, really liked this story in the end. But the first half, I was having a lot of trouble connecting with the future story because it was written as, it was like one guy's opinion about whether or not this new technology was a good thing or not. For a pretty sustained period of time. Once it changed and it started to be a story about his life and the way this technology had impacted his relationship with his daughter, and there's some really interesting things that happened that I won't talk about. Actually, then I was back in and really loved the story in the end. But yeah, it needed that human grounding was what like brought it home for me.
I personally liked his arc, the narrator's arc throughout. I thought it worked.
I thought
it totally worked for me. I didn't have any trouble getting into that one. But I agree with you on all points there. Just I hadn't even thought of writing as a technology. Such a cool, such a wonderful mind Ted Chiang has.
I love how
And
much you love him. Like even in the summary earlier, it was like so clearly Cody's review of how much you love Ted Chiang. This has been a really fun episode, like for me to see. So Cody's been telling me how much he loves Ted Chiang for like years. So excited to finally, I love it. I love how much you love him. It's great.
The summary was maybe not as objective as some summaries have been.
It was perfect.
He also makes a lot of interesting, very succinct philosophical insights as well. You know, in addition to the scientific insights, some of my favorite, lines from various stories. Empathy is to sympathy as intuiting is to being intellectually aware. That's a paraphrase, but that's from the story Understanding in Stories of Your Life and Others. And that, I mean, these just speak for themselves. And the idea from the same story, the idea of spiritual insight or spiritual enlightenment is what we usually talk about, but you could also have rational enlightenment. And I loved the bifurcation of those two types of enlightenment. And then another quote from the story, the eponymous story, Exhalation. I am not air. I am the pattern that it assumed temporarily. From the narrator of that story. Just these powerful, succinct, philosophical insights that have stayed with me for quite a long time.
So let's talk about some of the, we've mentioned like how many of these stories involve like a really interesting, piece of science or tech. Should we like talk about some of them, tease them a little bit?
Yeah. I think you should start because I've been talking a lot.
Okay, deal. The brain acceleration in Understand, I liked quite a bit. We'll let you read it, but basically there's like a treatment that ends up giving this guy like radically increased mental powers. It came out before the movie Limitless.
And before the book 10 years before the book that the movie Limitless is based on.
Yeah, for sure. I think the closest parallel to this that I've actually read is like Flowers for Algernon. I think there's like some parallels in the way that tech like kind of works and limitations or whatever. Anyway, you should read it. It's great. And really the end of the book is about like, if you were super intelligent, like what would you do with that? And what would different kinds of people do with that? How would you relate to other people? It's just like, it was a really interesting book and it was written in first person and just like felt like super wild, like a totally different mental state to be in. That was a fun one.
Kind of a fun narrative twist at the end too. Like it's an exciting story. He doesn't do a lot of action writing, but they're always really exciting mysteries to unravel, or you're way in the narrative, even though there's not always a huge, climax, an epic climax that we're building up to in terms of action.
Yeah, for sure.
The other one that was really interesting is language in Story of Your Life, which he really is interested in exploring in Story of Your Life, both language and how a creature would possibly experience time as a dimension lived in and intuited rather than just intellectualized upon. And he makes that bridge through language and how we think about language.
Yeah, it's like the language, does the language that you speak change the way that you think? Really reminded me of like the key themes of Babel 17, the Samuel Delany book from the 60s, which is also really interesting and short. The other thing I would say about this one that was really crazy, this is a physics principle. I don't feel like it's a spoiler. We can talk about it. It's Fermat's principle of least action. So it turns out when a light beam strikes water, light moves more slowly through water than it does through air. So it bends. And it turns out that the course that it takes is the resulting path is always the shortest possible path to reach the point where it eventually lands. The amount of refraction is such that that whatever spot it gets to, it took the shortest path to get there. And it sort of raises this really interesting question of like, well, when the light beam is leaving the star, like how does it know where it's going to land?
How does it know the path?
Yeah. And it picks the path that will be fastest to get to that spot. And that is a really interesting, just kind of like blows your mind a little bit about the way time works. And light clearly is, with the theory of relativity, and light does not actually, time doesn't work the way our brains think time works, basically. And this is a really interesting sort of thought experiment and way to get you to see that.
Using this scientific principle imposed on the context and the characters in the world, like is the first and maybe only time where I've gotten close to intuiting the fourth dimension and that, thinking of it as a spatial dimension, because that's all we can do with our brains conceptually, but it gets you really close to understanding what it would be like, or why, or how a being could live in the fourth dimension as it truly exists, and not how we exist in it.
Another cool one is the prisms in Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom in Exhalation. They're a device that when you turn it on, it creates a quantum event, basically, and then it splits the timeline from there. And so then there's a tablet in each timeline, and you can like type and talk between the two. And so it's sort of like a technology that sort of like makes multidimensionality into like a thing you can interact with really interesting implications that I don't think we need to get too much into, but like, wow, mind-blowing idea that was really fun to explore.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, other ones, we've already mentioned a couple of them, but 72 Letters has the golems and the exploring coding and genetic manipulation in a magical realm. We get to explore entropy through an alien narrator in an alien universe, really, that Ted Chiang has invented, and understand entropy a little bit better and its implications, because we're seeing it in a totally different environment.
Yeah, that's Exhalation, which is like maybe my favorite short story of all of these, actually, was the title story from Exhalation. That one was wild. And it does not actually ever use I can't remember if it ever uses the word entropy, but if it does, it's like in passing once, maybe in his afterward notes. But in any case, it's not about entropy or heat death. But if you've ever like heard those terms, you're curious about what they might mean, read the short story. It like lands it in a really concrete way. And he does it in it's just so wild. They live in like a chromium plated universe. And anyway, I'll just let you read it. It's so fun. But anyway.
Yeah, it really is. That's definitely one of my favorites too. His mythological stuff also has a lot of, he draws on a lot of really cool traditions. Like he has the Tower of Babylon, which is his very first short story.
That one's so good too. That's also in the running for my favorite one.
It's about the Tower of Babel, building the Tower of Babel, and he imposes the science fiction on it in that he gets really into like the tech of brick and mortar tower building.
Like how did they mine in 5000 BC? Like you'll learn if you read this book.
Yeah. And then obviously some cool like philosophical existential concepts on top of that as well. But it's a really interesting world to explore science fiction through. Why go there? And it totally worked. And then you also have the Alchemist's Gate, which is the first short story in Exhalation.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, if time travel got invented in like the year 900, yeah, it's very cool. So we should also talk about Arrival, just because I think that's the way. Like, I saw Arrival before I read these books as well. I think a lot of people probably will have had that experience. So, what did you think about the movie versus the short story?
It's the example I use of how to successfully adapt prose to film. I think that the story of your life versus Arrival is a perfect example of like the same story and the core of the story being told, but what prose is good at, the story is different, and what cinema is good at, the story is different. So they feel very different, even though the core of them is the same. And even Ted Chiang has said he thought it was a wonderful adaptation. But the prose really explores like the ideas and the thoughts of the characters, and there's not as much action versus the movie, which adds more suspense, action.
Introduced this the like high level like international conflict that has to get resolved. Like none of that was in the short story. They created that all from scratch for the movie, and it was perfect. It fit so perfectly in line with like the themes of the story, but made it like you were saying, made it work for the big screen. I agree with you. I think it's the best. And it was also fun because it like added something new that was better for that medium. Anyway, yeah, I totally agree. It was a really, really fun movie, and hopefully it will inspire a lot more people to read these books.
Right. If you read a book version of the movie Arrival, you'd be like, this is fine. And if you watched a movie version of the novella, you'd be like, this is fine. But they're both so great. So yeah, my favorite example too. The other thing, the last thing we want to mention about these collections, which is really fun and I haven't seen before, is Ted Chiang just has these very modest, matter-of-fact, ego removed descriptions of why he's written each short story after they complete. So there's the author's notes right after each story, and they're always so they're so fun. He's like, yeah, I borrowed this idea from this. I saw this physics lecturer talk about this, and I thought about it, and I thought, what if blah blah blah, and you really just get the description from the author of why the story exists and why he told it directly after reading it, which is super fun.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, we both really love this book, obviously. What, if people like this, what else should they be reading? What should we recommend?
Well, first off, I think there's an easy comparison in Ken Liu. He also has two wonderful short story collections that are science fiction, some of them are a little fantasy bend. He explores a little bit more about racial identity, where Ted Chiang doesn't. But he has two short story collections, the Paper Menagerie and Other Stories, and The Hidden Girl and Other Stories, that are both just fantastic.
For sure. Yeah.
Ken Liu.
I will also, Ken Liu. I will also recommend short stories. We're doing all short story, like anthology recommendations. Since we're normally always doing novels, this seemed like a fun excuse to like talk about some of those great short story collections. So I'm going to go with I, Robot by Isaac Asimov. I think that's probably like the first collection of short sci-fi stories I ever read. And they're just amazing. I mean, if you've seen the I, Robot movie, you're like familiar with these like 3 laws of robotics, but that movie is such a pale, bad version of the crazy thought experiments that Asimov does. Basically, the short version of it is like there's some robots that are like seems like they're not working properly with, usually somewhat bad outcomes, and somebody has to go and figure out like what's going wrong with the 3 robots. And it's like a logic problem with the 3 laws of robotics, and they are really fun and interesting to read. So anyway, yeah, highly recommend those.
That's the bad example of the movie adaptation.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then finally, another short story collection, very quintessential and old school, Welcome to the Monkey House by Kurt Vonnegut. I had to put it on the list just because it's just so good. It's, it's different than, it's written so long before the new science fiction stuff, the Ted Chiang and the Ken Liu's, that it's a lot different. But Vonnegut has the timeless voice of humor and zany ideas. Just zaniness in general, and so it's a delightful read. It's a great collection as well.
For sure. All right. Well, I hope you all check out Ted Chiang. You love it. We'll see you next week for Cixin Liu, and. Yeah, keep reading, everybody.
Yeah. See you, man.
Bye.